1, and we're going to aim to be as efficient as possible. So we're going to jump right into the presentation and get started. So Mental Health Literacy 101, we're going to cover 5 key terms in the next 30 minutes. But first, I want to introduce myself as one of the presenters and then my co-presenter here, Treena. My name is Kelly Pallanti. I am SHRMP-SCP. That is SHRM's Senior Certified Global Professional. And I'm also Mental Health First Aid Certified. I am the CEO and founder of Kennedy Global HR. We focus primarily on workplace mental health safety, employee well-being programs, and also small and mid-sized business people operations. Oops.
That's okay. I don't need to read it about myself. My name is Treena Reilkoff, and I'm the other presenter. My business CEO is TLR Solutions for Conflict. I am in Canada, and Kelly is in the US. So this is a collaboration of North America. My title I use is a conflict management and resiliency specialist with certifications in psychological health and safety, assessments, trauma-informed practices framework, resiliency training, and workplace assessments and restoration. And I'd like to welcome everybody here today to get a baseline. And the idea of this workshop is to kind of create some curiosity, start the conversations happening in your workplace, and kind of reduce the stigma.
Yes. Like we kind of mentioned in the chat, this is really a really great step to get started, to start the mental health safety conversation, start talking about mental health in the workplace. One of the reasons why I am really focused on this area is I was in HR during the pandemic, like many, and started dealing a lot with the mental health safety issues of the people in the organization. And I just didn't have a lot of the tools and resources to do so. Number one, I just wasn't educated in that area. And also, I didn't know how to communicate that to other people in the organization. So this has really been my focus since then, is how can I help bring mental health safety inside organizations? I think the pandemic has given us, I like to say, the perfect excuse to talk about mental health, because we've had so many mental health issues come up since then. And so this is the time to really reduce the stigma and bring it to the forefront. So I'm going to have Treena's going to start off today and talk about our first term.
And before we get started, though, I'm just going to add some stats to keep in mind why we've chosen these 5 topics or subjects, titles, areas. So what we do know is that 55% of leaders fear workplace stigma of mental health. And that's a recent one out of Deloitte and LifeWorks combined, so a combination of US, Canada. We also know that there is a return on investment of creating a psychologically safe work environment. PricewaterhouseCoopers has found out through their assessments and their surveys, there's a 230% return on every dollar invested in proactive mental health in the workplace. Yeah. And the Psychological Association of America has received new information on their data collection that 81% of workers are now looking for workplaces that will support mental health. So it's very important that we get a baseline of what does mental health and psychological safety in the workplace look like. So the first topic, or the first title, is what is mental health? The World Health Organization definition is mental health is the foundation of well-being and effective functioning for an individual and for a community. It is a positive sense of well-being, and it is the absence of mental illness or mental condition. So how I like to kind of describe mental health, and when we're looking after our own mental health and our mental well-being, use the analogy of our heart and our brain. Mental health is we're looking at our brain. So when you do proactive self-care for your heart, you exercise, you eat well, you don't smoke, you limit or decide healthy choices to keep your heart healthy, because without your heart, right, we're not here. And sometimes you could be the fittest person living the healthiest lifestyle, running marathons, and you can still experience a heart attack. So if you're in the workplace and a fellow coworker or a leader, manager, C-suite had a heart attack, would you have a stigma of them coming back to work because they had a heart attack? Or would you accept them coming back to work and help support them in a safe environment? So when we're looking at mental health, the brain, the idea is to keep our brain healthy, reduce stress, reduce burnout, make healthy choices, sleep well, eat well, exercise. It all helps support our brain. So sometimes we too can be living the healthiest life or have some adjustments, some conflict, trauma, or stressors come into our life, and then it impacts our brain. And I would like to use the analogy, you can prepare and be proactive to protect your heart, but you don't know when that heart attack's going to come. And that's like the brain. You don't know when you're going to have that brain attack, suicidal ideation, somebody commits suicide, a panic attack, depression. So when somebody has mental health concerns or they've experienced something and they're not up to their healthy self, remember the stigma. Your brain is just like your heart, and we try to keep them both healthy personally and in our environmental contexts. So that's kind of the takeaway of understanding what is mental health, what you do to keep your brain healthy, the eating, the sleeping, your surroundings, stress reduction. It's the choices you make on stress, decisions related to others, and the environment you put yourself in.
Yes, I love the comparison to physical health, because it is interesting that we decided at one point to separate the brain really from the rest of the body, because they do, completely impact each other. That's one of the statistics we have here in the U.S. is when an organization experiences poor mental health, their physical health, so their health insurance premiums go up and their costs go up because people are experiencing more heart attacks, more things that are causing poor physical health. So I love that comparison. All right. Number 2.
So number 2 is, what is a mental health illness, condition, or disorder? So what that is, it's an actual medical diagnosis. So when you go to the doctor, you can experience a trauma, conflict, adversity, and it's short term. And it might not lead to a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, but a short-term experience, and you go to the doctor because you're having problems eating, sleeping, can't sleep or can't think, rumination, panicky, right? And you get diagnosed. That is a mental illness. Mm-hmm. So the analogy as well to think about it is, even though you might have been diagnosed with depression, panic disorder, anxiety, and anxiety is a very common one right now due to COVID, which is a worldwide trauma experience. It does not dictate who you are as a person or how you live your life or your ability to function in the workplace. It's a diagnosis. So when we want to break down again the stigma, if somebody is labeled, right, and it's confidentiality, you don't have to share your diagnosis. But for yourself, if you're diagnosed with a mental illness, it's recognizing it's just a diagnosis. It's not something to be shameful of, because again, it's your brain, right? And that's a major organ. Are people shameful, or do we use stigma against people who are diagnosed with diabetes or epilepsy? No. So this is again where we want to create that conversation of understanding, just because you have a mental health diagnosis does not mean you are not able to function and flourish at the top of your capacity. You're able to manage a mental illness, a mental diagnosis, just like people manage their diabetes, their epilepsy, their high blood sugar. It's manageable. So we want to really break down that stigma that if you are diagnosed with something, it does not mean it is negatively impacting your life and your everyday ability to function for the rest of your life.
Yes. And I just want to make a comment about something that Sid typed in the chat. And I have just learned to try to redirect my language in this area too. So I am very glad that you brought that up. He mentions that just like people can't commit heart attacks, people don't commit suicide. They die by suicide. Suicide is actually, what happens as a result of something. So I think that it is really important to reframe that language, because commit suicide is what what we hear, I would say, in media, what we hear in television, entertainment. So it is really important to start reframing. So thank you for adding that in. All right. Which comes to number 3. So I'm going to talk a little bit about psychological safety. And this is actually going to take us in a little bit different direction now. And the reason why I want to include this one is because this one, and then what we're going to talk about next is psychological health and safety, get very confused. And I see them actually out there quite often confused. So psychological safety is something that actually is developed inside the workplace. And this term was originally coined by Dr. Amy Edmondson in the early 90s. And basically what she's describing is a workplace, so an environment at work that's been formed where people feel like they can be their authentic selves. And that means that they feel like they can make mistakes and it's okay. What they call kind of like fail forward, that you're able to take things and learn. And by doing that, what they discovered is that teams actually become a lot more innovative, a lot more productive because they don't have fear inside the organization. They are able to bring their whole selves. And that includes bringing, whatever mental illness or physical disability, mental disability that they bring with them. One of the things that, if you do decide to disclose, a mental illness or disability inside your organization is that we do have accommodations for that. That's something that just like if you would come to work with a broken leg, we would accommodate you and help you maybe get a different seat or help you into work, maybe accommodate your hours of how you work. I've done the same thing with mental health. Just how do you accommodate to help that person to work? Sometimes the accommodations are really small and do not impact the organization in a negative way. So psychological safety is more really kind of creating this safe environment where people feel what they call belonging, right? They feel like they can be themselves and be authentic inside the organization. So, go ahead. Go ahead.
Of the psychological safety is we're going to share 2 standards, and Kelly will first share about the first international standard.
Yes. So the first one here, now this is, as you can see, so psychological safety was the prior term. So this one is psychological health and safety. They're so similar. But what I'd like you to kind of think about the front is almost like psychological, like mental health. So mental health and safety, very similar. And this is tied directly to this ISO standard 45003 is the technical term. If you're not familiar with ISO, these are global standards. We have 26 countries that have signed on to this particular standard. And this is in addition to their occupational health and safety and management standard. And it's so new, it came out just last June, so June 2021. And this is an excellent, to me, framework about how to build psychological health and safety at work, how to assess the environment, how to apply the plan and get roles in place and make things successful. And then, of course, most importantly, measuring. But what you're really looking for when you're doing all that is managing what they call psychosocial risks. And psychosocial risks are basically hazards inside the organization that can harm your brain, that can harm your mind. Those are risks that I, again, just like to equate it to something physical. So in our OSHA standards in the United States, we can't have cords sitting out in the middle of the aisles of offices, right? Because that would be a physical hazard. We have to remove those. Same thing with psychosocial hazards. How do we remove hazards in the workplace that are negatively affecting people's mental health? So this is really the difference there between the psychological safety and psychological health and safety. And so this standard, again, is new. A lot of organizations are starting to take a look at the framework. But what is really interesting is how it aligns with the Canadian standards. And so that's where I think Treena could really pick up and add some more perspective here.
Yeah. So when we're again looking at psychological health and safety, we are actually in Canada here looking at legislative terms. Yeah. So it's actual law that you have to comply with. So in Canada, under the Canadian Occupational Health and Safety, a psychological health and safe workplace is one that promotes workplace psychological well-being and activity to prevent harm to the worker and to prevent psychological health, to avoid and mitigate negligent, reckless, or intentional ways. So what does that mean when we're looking at the ISO standards? Legislative requirements. So in Canada, each province has their own occupational health and safety, but then federally, we have what we call Bill C-65, which encompasses workplace violence, and that is where the occupational health and labor standards are also included. The connection with the ISO standards that are worldwide that just came out was that Canada actually was the first in the world that kind of started the psychosocial risk factors. So in Canada, we have what's called the Canadian National Standards of Psychological Health and Safety. And within this standard, there's actually 13 psychosocial factors that you can assess and actually find metrics, calculate the actual metrics in your workplace of what percentage and how many people in totality that participate are experiencing psychosocial hazards. So
give us an example of a hazard, Treena.
So, great question. So one example of one of the psychosocial hazards or social factors is how does a workplace create psychological protection?
Yes.
One way of creating psychological protection, which is proactive, and that's not EAP, because EAP is a reactive measure, solely the responsibility of the employee. It has no bearing on the organization. So creating a psychological protective factor in the workplace is what we're offering today, is sharing an opportunity to understand terminology, create the conversation, and start, deciding what does that look like for us in our workplace? Where do we want to go from here? So by understanding the language and the literacy, the workplace is creating psychological protection, because when people come with various complaints or concerns, you will have a better understanding of how to accommodate or mitigate the risk. So just like a slip and fall, you put salt on ice outside the front entrance. What you're doing for psychological protection as a risk mitigation is you're creating the literacy, the understanding of what all these terms mean and how they all link together. And how they all link together is when we're looking at the term, what is psychological health? Psychological health has 4 components: mental health, emotional health, spiritual, and social. When you look at psychological health and safety, psychosocial risks, you're looking at what are the environmental risks and what does the organization have the ability and role to do to mitigate these risks.
Yes. And that's what I get so excited about the standard, because I feel like it, and the legislation, because it outlines it all for you. It tells you what you need to do. It gives you the metrics. But when I talked with a group of HR, professionals recently, I explained it to them as just like any kind of change management or any kind of new, measurement that we're doing inside the organization. It's really the same method. You're going to assess the environment. You need to have a baseline of what you're starting with. Then you're going to make a plan of action, which always involves training, looking at existing policies, building out roles. One of the things that I love about some of the Australian legislation and some of the companies there is that they have these roles. It's a mental health specialist inside the organization. So it doesn't always have to go to HR. And I think that's, a fair thing to look at too, from our perspective. It's like, how do we support people inside the organization? Will it necessarily fall under the HR hat for the US, or will HR help build the capacity for that, build out roles that will help support, the people inside the company? But I really want to get to our last one, because I feel like this is one that a lot of people are interested in right now. And of course, this is Treena's specialty, is trauma-informed. So yes, tell us about trauma-informed.
So what trauma-informed descriptor is, and I look at it as you become a trauma-informed professional but organizations also learn about what does becoming trauma-informed mean and how to implement trauma-informed frameworks into their strategic plans, their policies, their everyday work life. So being trauma-informed means that you understand and recognize the presence of trauma. You understand and recognize the role it plays in every individual's life, because we're all human. And you provide an environment that helps support an individual and collectively should a trauma experience happen. So when we look at COVID right now, it is a worldwide trauma. And what's going on right now with the return to work, the great resignation, how do we increase retention? When you look at COVID, it's a worldwide trauma. So everybody is experiencing some level of anxiety traits. Everybody is experiencing some level of hypervigilance. It's like, and some people, if this word triggers you, please reach out to somebody for support and understanding why this may have triggered you. An analogy myself and a police officer we're having a discussion with is COVID is like being stalked. You don't know when you might experience COVID, but it's everywhere around you, and you have to take precautions and proactive measures. So what are workplaces doing to understand that high level of trauma experiences employees are having? What would be a trauma response? So if you look at some of the people coming back to work who have not been in an office for, say, 2 years, and now you're mandated to come back, has the organization or company created a safe environment where, as Kelly was sharing, it was psychologically safe so they can come to their manager, supervisor and say, I'm experiencing some anxiety symptoms, some uneasiness. Do they know how to recognize a trauma response? Somebody being avoided, somebody calling in sick. It might not be the perception that we always jump to of the negative, but they might be having a trauma response. So becoming trauma-informed is educating yourself of the impact of trauma on everybody, how to create a framework in the workplace, how to recognize when you yourself might be having a trauma response, and what skill sets do you have as an organization, as an individual, and what are the frameworks or the risk mitigation measures that you have in place to help support becoming trauma-informed. So again, just like the legislative, psychological health and safety, or creating that safe environment where people can come speak freely and not be stigmatized and bring concerns so there's proactive resolution to mitigate conflict. One risk mitigation strategy of creating a psychological health and safe workplace, both litigation-wise, labor code-wise, and just being a better well-being environmental place of psychological safety and well-being, is becoming trauma-informed. And again, becoming curious. What does that mean? How do all these different terms tie into each other, right? They all support each other, but they are distinctly different. So when workplaces talk about wellness, psychological wellness is one silo of wellness. Emotional wellness, that's one silo. So wellness does not encompass the 5 topics we talked about today. They are just 2 silos, 3 silos of what wellness means overall.
Yes. And I, Sid mentioned, again in the chat, and I know you had brought that up too, Treena, is we are reactive right now. When I talk with organizations about, what to do for mental health, the immediate reaction is we have an EAP, which is an employee assistance program. And that's all and that's good. That is one part of that. That is part of building resilience for employees. That is part of supporting their mental health to give them the resources, but it is just one part. I always say it's like kind of giving somebody a hard hat, but then you still put them in a building where bricks are falling on their head. Exactly. It's like you gave them the PPE, but you didn't stop the bricks from falling. So you didn't really change the work environment.
and that's a perfect analogy, because the workplace provided the hard hat. The workplace provided the EAP, but it's solely up to the employee whether or not they access the EAP, and it's solely up to the employee whether or not they put on that hard hat. So from that risk mitigation, to say you have EAP, it does not influence, there's our 5-minute mark. Okay. It does not influence burnout, Burnout, again, it's a huge topic. Burnout is organizational responsibility because the factors that influence burnout, the employee cannot change. The employee can manage burnout symptoms, but they might necessarily not be able to change the environmental context that is influencing the burnout.
Yes. So true. And burnout is like one of the number one topics I think talked about right now. I see that all over social media and any rooms where we talk about mental and psychological safety, because so many people, like you mentioned, this was a product of the pandemic, is that we were overworked. And a lot of it, I keep saying, is that there's no playbook for this either. There was no playbook for the pandemic. We were literally doing it, writing it as we were going along. And I think there's not a lot of, time now. Like now we have so much room for innovation in this space because there is just no cookie cutter way to talk about, like mental health. How can we really start advancing it? So I know we're at our time, so I'm going to go through.
Can I add just one more thing to that? Just kind of leave this at the end, is that, as she was saying, there's no playbook. Here's our opportunity in life right now that we all get to be a part of creating our leadership legacy. And by becoming trauma-informed, by starting the conversations, by sharing what you've learned today to create that conversation and be a part of the change, we are building worldwide intergenerational trauma resiliency. Because we're learning from what our experience is, and we're going to help prepare, because trauma sits on our epigenetics and is transferred down 7 generations. So if trauma can be shared through generational, so can our resiliency. So now is the time to create our leadership legacy and be a part of creating intergenerational trauma resiliency.
Yes. Yay. And I will just add that Treena and I, we are partners and we offer a solution together. So when we send the follow-up information, we'll send a link to that. We offer a simple framework solution, mainly to get your organization started. So a lot of the assessment, getting a basis of where you are, getting some education sessions out there too, and some measuring. So a good way to take that leap into looking at mental health safety inside your company. And then Treena does also have a partner page on KennedyGlobalHR.com, which also there's a link to her personal page and her contact information as well. And also, I just want to say, again, we can't stop saying after this, we'd like you to go start talking about mental health in your organization, share this webinar, share one term that you learned inside of a meeting, because we are really trying to get across in the workplace that mental health is health. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.